this to this. From this to this. Transforming raw metal into civilization is a journey that began before the Bronze Age and takes us into a gleaming future. Human progress forged in the blacksmith's fire. Now, metal on Modern Marvels. Brute muscle, forged metal. Combine these two elemental forces and you've got civilization itself. The very structure of our constructed world is wrought from these basic elements. The cadence of our progress is in the measured ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Our soaring skyscrapers, our sturdy bridges and expansive ocean liners, our jet planes and rockets. You can't escape the power and necessity of metal. It is the natural material that we have reshaped into our grandest man-made structures.
We have come to a point in history when metal is really infiltrated every aspect of our life. It's very difficult to avoid the simple fact that it probably is the primary material that we use to extend ourselves.
Metals have characteristics that are ideal for nearly everything that makes the modern world modern. Some conduct heat or electricity. Others are easily stretched into wire. Some resist cracking and breaking. Many are shiny or exhibit enormous strength when joined with other elements. And many of them can be worked and shaped.
Metal is a very resistant material that I have to cajole, fight, come to compromises with in order to manipulate, to bend it to my will, to make what I want to make with it.
Metals are everywhere, not just in the obviously metallic steel pillars and aluminum cans. Calcium in our teeth and bones, and silicon in glass are both metals when they are in their pure elemental state. Metals make up 2/3 of all the known elements. An element is made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons, forming an atom that cannot be reduced into other substances. All elements are cataloged in the periodic table, which lists each element in an ascending scale based on its atomic number, or number of protons and electrons making up its atoms.
And so they go in rows across the periodic table. And the last column in the periodic table are called the noble elements, and those are very stable. And so all the other elements kind of want to be like those. And they can do that by giving up an electron, or more electrons, or losing electrons.
One definition of metals is that they are elements grouped mostly on the unstable side of the periodic table. They are likely to give up an electron in order to bond with other elements. The key to metals is this ability to bond with other elements and compounds to form substances called alloys with completely new and unique properties. Iron, for instance, becomes ferrous oxide or rust when it bonds with oxygen in the air.
Because oxygen is present in the environment, we do not find most metals in their metallic form or in a pure form or in a metallic state. We find them in oxide form. They're bonded or linked with oxygen.
Metals alloy with lots of other elements besides oxygen. In fact, alloys often exhibit properties that make them more than just the sum of their elemental parts.
A lot of people will talk about steel. There are lots of types of steel. There's iron in steel, but there are other things in there as well. And if you change that composition, you will change the properties.
For our ancestors, defining a metal was easier. They knew that the shiny rocks that were often clustered in specific areas, or sometimes found on the ground, were often stronger than the flinty ones, and they bent rather than broke when pounded. According to archaeologists, toward the end of the Stone Age, more than 6,500 years ago, the first metal to undergo human manipulation was likely copper, which could be found in deposits throughout the world, sometimes loosely embedded in the soil, or in outcroppings.
Copper is available in nature in what's called a native state, which is an unalloyed state. It will combine with chemicals from its surroundings to turn a bright blue or to turn a bright green, which made it easily identified. And when in this native state, could be hammered into objects relatively easily.
They probably started to use and integrate into their lives, and it was through the fact that it was weighty, had weight, maybe made them want to use it as an implement of some type. And soon they learned that with the presence of heat, that it was more malleable and they could form it into shapes. And I think things just evolved from there.
Copper was originally mined with bones and rocks to pry out the metal ore. An ore is an amalgam of rock and metal.
They were then able to begin to dig into the ground and follow those veins of ore. And eventually, man built fires against the rock and then doused them with cold water in order to break the rock and extract the copper from it.
The broken pieces of ore were gathered up and smelted or heated to the metal's melting temperature, usually in a heat-resistant ceramic container. In the case of copper, which melts at a relatively low 1,981 degrees Fahrenheit, that process wasn't too difficult. Today, coppersmiths follow roughly the same procedure.
What we're doing is we're pouring an ingot. We have molds here that have been have carbon on them. Traditionally, they would have used well oil, burnt that to create carbon on the molds to release the metal once it's molten and poured into the molds themselves.
Smelting enabled us to shape copper into both tools and decorations.
I'm looking for this nice yellow glow. I'm going to brush it off to make sure that I don't have any scale or dirt on there. And now we're going to come over and I'm going to have them start sledgehammering. So we're trying to get a consistent thickness through the whole billet to make sheet. Go ahead. Whoa!
Repeated hammering flattens and hardens copper by compressing the copper atoms into a tighter configuration.
Above all, it was forging, the ability to hammer it. When copper is hammered, it becomes work hardened. And work hardening makes it stiffer, more brittle.
It can then be hammered further into tools or decorative pieces like this. Copper had its limitations. It's soft and can't hold a sharp edge. But with the introduction of other metals came stronger copper alloys. No more than 9% tin could be added to the melted copper to produce the alloy bronze, which was harder than copper and more easily worked.
How it was discovered will always be a mystery. I think it's just naturally that two materials got mixed together, perhaps lost in a fire. At the next day, they cleaned out the fire pit and there was something that was once a copper object and now was something different.
Early civilizations in both China and the Middle East were the first to forge bronze. As the technology traveled along trade routes, it radiated out from those areas as early as 7,000 years ago. The usefulness of bronze, particularly for weapons such as swords and axes, prompted historians to refer to this first stage of our large-scale use of metals as the Bronze Age.
It had such a significant impact on the quality of life for humans at that time. It just improved their ability to survive. It was an insurance policy in a lot of ways that gave them an extension of their will.
Today, copper and bronze are still used for decoration and jewelry. Because copper is ductile or can be made into wire, and conductive, it is ideal for electrical wiring. The strength of bronze makes it perfect for bearings, pinions, washers, and other important machine parts. But the age when bronze dominated forged metals ended when a better, more plentiful element supplanted it. That metal was iron. All United States nickels, dimes, and quarters are made of copper or copper alloys. A thin metal cladding of copper and nickel provides their silvery shine. Iron, the material that supports our civilization. Its age began approximately 2,500 years ago throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa, a period in which it superseded the alloy bronze. Acquiring copper and especially tin, which were not always found in proximity to each other, proved difficult as their value increased.
At that point, people had become quite reliant on bronze as a material to improve their lives. And so when this was interrupted and they couldn't get the valuable tin to make the bronze, they turned to iron.
Although iron was softer than bronze, it was more plentiful. The fourth most abundant element on Earth. An early source of iron was extraterrestrial, meteorites that had penetrated Earth's atmosphere, giving the metal a supernatural aura. Early man must have observed the meteors in the sky, found the metal on the ground, and put two and two together.
The Egyptians had a word, bon-pet, which meant iron from heaven. And the Assyrians, the Hebrews, and so forth all had words in their vocabulary that describe that.
Iron was so important to human progress that it would become the most important structural metal for roughly 2 millennia. Men worked iron in the blacksmith shop, a place of fiery and almost mystical transformation, where seemingly useless rocks become vital tools.
The fact that they used fire and they were control of fire probably brought them to a religious status in a lot of ways.
That tradition survives today at specialized shops and educational programs, like Southern Illinois University's metalsmithing program. Some of the equipment is modern, but the methods and the materials go back thousands of years.
I have iron ore in this pile and in this rock form, and I have limestone right here, and it's basically just road gravel like you would find on a gravel road in most parts of the country. We're going to crush the iron ore up, as you see, and that then will be put in the crucible. And crushing, very simple process. This gets loaded into our crucible. And the limestone, this will melt at a lower temperature than the iron will, and it will cover it and control oxidation so that we reduce the materials down to small nodules.
The limestone is called a flux, a substance that acts like a sealant, protecting the metal from oxidation when it melts. A heat-resistant ceramic crucible is then placed in a furnace. Gas ovens speed the process that in antiquity would have taken about 12 hours. In less than 2, the material at roughly 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit bubbles out of the crucible as it forms a bloom. As the mixture is poured out, the flux separates from the hot, spongy iron.
Then we will take that spongy mass and hammer it into a recognizable shape that we see iron in a lot of times. And these represent that.
But this is only midpoint in the metal's transformation. The next step for the ancient blacksmiths would have been to make these wrought iron pieces into something useful, using traditional and ancient tools. The bellows to increase the flow of oxygen, raising the temperature of the fire. The anvil, the surface on which to place the metal, and the hammer with which to pound it.
Now this is what's called a billet. It's just separate pieces of iron that will be stacked together and in the fire will be fused together by called forge welding. When it's lightly tapped, the molecules start to mesh between the two. And then as you forge it a little longer and a little longer, it becomes one piece instead of multiple pieces.
If the right temperature is reached, characterized by an even yellow glow, the billet will more easily fuse together with hammering.
If we get overzealous, it can easily split apart. And this oxide is just a scale that's forming at high temperatures. So by brushing it, I get a cleaner surface.
Once the surface is brushed, the smith sprinkles the billet with borax. The borax also acts as a flux, forming a glassy sealant on the hot iron billet and preventing more oxidation. Hammering slowly shapes the metal, in this case into an axe head.
This tool is called a drift. The drift just basically opens up a hole and turns it into whatever shape the drift is, okay? So by driving this in here, it's gradually spreading it out and shaping the size of the hole.
A few more hits and it's done. From crushed stone to useful tool within the seemingly supernatural realm of the blacksmith. Other metals were valued for precisely the opposite reason that iron was. Gold is one of the rarest elements and least utilitarian because of its softness. But its yellow luster has captivated all cultures that have encountered it.
The sun material. It was sort of an affirmative material. It was an optimistic material. The most important gods were either made of gold or covered with gold to symbol their superiority to lesser gods.
Gold doesn't oxidize or tarnish readily, is malleable, and melts at a relatively low temperature. In other words, it's perfect as a decoration and for coinage. In fact, gold was the perfect foundation for monetary systems throughout the world.
It was a symbol of strength, of wealth, of political power. It has this sort of mystique about it as being a symbol of success.
Like copper, gold was first discovered in its native state, shining from surface deposits or in rich veins.
The Egyptians in Nubia, which is a rich gold area, which is now part of Sudan, were the first ones to develop significant ability to do underground tunnel mining. And they would dig out entire rooms and create ventilation systems and use primitive methods to bring the ore up.
The search for gold spurred colonization of the New World in the 16th century, particularly among the Spanish conquistadors in the Americas. Although they never found the fabled El Dorado, or lost city of gold, they managed to find and steal enough to make Spain, for the time, the most wealthy of the European powers. As explorers set out across the oceans in search of gold, early European metallurgists struggled to find a way to magically create it.
You might have heard of the alchemists. Back in the older days, there was a field of science where people wanted to turn everything into gold. And really, this is kind of the field that led to chemistry.
Alchemy, a complex mix of physics and metaphysics, arrived in Europe as early as the 9th century. Alchemists were preoccupied with the essential nature of substances and their ability to transform into other ones. Some believed that everything was made of small particles with hooks on them that helped them connect with other particles. Rearrange and renumber the connections, and you could, according to the alchemists, recreate elements, possibly out of combinations of mercury and sulfur, or lead.
Their premise of transmutating other materials into gold, this idea of, creating the riches as opposed to mining or finding or conquering for them, and the use of energy to do that, which led them to explore and open doors that they had no real foreseeable understanding of.
The alchemists were mostly wrong, but almost right about some things. Their search to make gold led them to discover useful metal alloys, and the concept of identifying elements by their burning characteristics. Arguably the most famous alchemist of all was Sir Isaac Newton, who attempted to create gold from the base metal lead. Many of Newton's useful discoveries about the nature of gravity were derived from his misguided efforts to make gold. Today, gold's properties make it an important element used for more than jewelry and coins. Because its electrons are able to move freely, gold is an excellent conductor of electricity. And it could be made into extremely fine sheets and wires.
Gold is being used in computer equipment and a lot of other high-tech electronics industry. Of course, there's also the dental industry where gold crowns are very prevalent and have been over time.
Gold is also used for electrical contacts in the aerospace industry because of its resistance to oxidation or corrosion.
And so, in simple terms, it would be that the contacts in a particular piece of equipment will not oxidize, the surface doesn't oxidize, and so the conductivity is maintained, particularly on spacecraft or satellites.
But the utility of gold is tempered by its scarcity. As dazzling as gold is, early smiths recognized an iron alloy known as steel as the more useful metal. With it, they would transform the world. Blacksmiths worked with black metals, such as iron. Whitesmiths worked with white metals, such as tin. The massive steel mill is the blacksmith shop on a large scale. Here, millions of tons of raw iron are transformed into steel. This process has changed little from the early Iron Age. Back then, blacksmiths recognized an alloy stronger than iron.
It wasn't until probably 1500 BC that carburized iron was really being worked on a broad scale. And that was sort of the beginning of sporadic steel use.
Steel, an alloy of iron and carbon, and a byproduct of the wrought iron forging process, was stronger, more pliant, and lighter than either iron, copper, or bronze. It became the material of choice for swords and armor. But smiths could only make steel in small quantities, and with difficulty. That is, until the mid-19th century, when steel production was revolutionized by Henry Bessemer.
The technology was developed independently by two different people, and Bessemer actually filed his patents in 1856.
Henry Bessemer's concept for mass production of steel was a byproduct of the Crimean War of 1854 to 56. Bessemer invented an artillery shell too powerful for the cast iron cannons being used to launch it. His solution was a stronger cannon made out of steel, but no method existed to make the alloy in the quantity that Bessemer needed. So, he created it himself. Bessemer designed a large bottle-shaped vessel into which liquid cast iron was poured.
And in the bottom, there were like huge air jets, and they would pump compressed air into this ladle and tilt it up. So the molten iron bath would go over the compressed air. The air would go through the iron, and in doing so, the oxygen would combine with the carbon in the iron and burn out the impurities, such as carbon and silicon.
Carbon could then be more easily reintroduced at specific levels to create a more balanced alloy, and the end result was steel. With greater control over the amount of carbon in the iron, smiths could better control the quality of the steel. Best of all, they could make more steel in less time than before. Mass production had begun. Within a decade, plants were built in the United States. Soon, more efficient methods for steel manufacture, such as the open hearth method, were adopted that didn't strip the steel of trace elements, such as manganese and silicon, like the Bessemer process did, giving manufacturers even more quality control.
Its design allowed it to accept a much wider range of raw materials. The productivity was higher, and very importantly, the open hearth process allowed the use of scrap. Scrap is already in a state of being steel, and the ability to reuse this raw material really is the cornerstone of steel recycling today. And steel today is the most recycled material, period.
By the mid-19th century, the Iron Age was replaced by the Industrial Revolution, and all of it supported by steel. In America, first came the railroads that raced westward on high-quality steel tracks. Next, the Great Plains fell to the steel farm equipment of settlers who worked the land. Skyscrapers rose as the strength of the steel I-beam enabled engineers to create an internal skeleton that sent offices reaching for the sky.
The money saved by being able to use a square piece of property but go higher and higher is really what makes steel the efficient product that it is.
Manhattan Island went vertical with steel, topped in 1931 by the Empire State Building at 1,250 feet. Steel bridges of strength and flexibility spanned previously unbridgeable gaps. Ships that would have collapsed under their own weight if they had been made of iron or wood could exceed 1,000 feet and 50,000 pounds when made of steel. And the automobile, invented in the midst of this revolution, relied on steel for its engine and body. Steel itself became an industry, with U.S. Steel leading the pack and helping to stimulate the giant American economy. At the turn of the 20th century, it was the largest company in the United States.
Tens of thousands of tons of steel per day are made in steel plants around the U.S. In the United States, in a year, we'll produce on the order of 100 million tons of steel.
Steel is as inexpensive per pound as a pound of potatoes. But just think of your day-to-day. You started out by getting off a steel spring bed, went downstairs and made some coffee on a steel coffee maker, a plate that was the heating plate, stirred the coffee with sugar and cream with a steel spoon, went down, got in your car, or got in a bus to go to your work, which are steel vehicles, went to your office, went up 7 flights of stairs, if you were really into exercise, or took the elevator, which was held up by a steel cable, and go on and on and on.
Today's steel manufacturers can produce grades of the alloy with properties to meet specific clients' demands for even lighter and stronger steel. These changes are often the result of variations in processing.
Some of the new steels that are being used in the auto industry, for an example, don't come because we changed the recipe of making steel, but changed the practice of rolling steel. The different temperatures that we reduce the product from a thick piece of steel to a thin piece of steel. All of that has a change in the microstructure of the steel and can give different properties which will result in different applications of use.
Being able to create steels that are ultra-formable and strong while retaining the low cost and being able to supply those at much thinner gauges so that you can design an automobile, and it's no more, if not less, to manufacture. Those are the kind of things that are happening in steel today.
The result is that 60% of the types of steel used in today's cars didn't even exist 10 years ago. Making these new steels possible are improvements in manufacture over the open hearth process.
It was succeeded by 2 processes that are in use today, the basic oxygen furnace and the electric arc furnace. But the preceding processes, Bessemer and open hearth, used air. And the basic oxygen furnace uses oxygen.
The electric arc furnace uses 2 large graphite electrodes lowered from a lid to generate an electric current through cold steel, usually scrap. The arc from the current melts the steel. In addition to oxygen, which is blown into the furnace to adjust the carbon content, other elements are also added to the furnace to produce the desired properties. In the end, waste and impurities called slag are poured off the top of the steel. The electric arc furnace is the most cost-effective method for producing quality steel today. As a result, steel manufacturers are able to supply every person in the United States with the 947 pounds of steel they consume every year. But even as steel manufacturers searched for lighter, stronger steel alloys, another metal existed that had many of those desirable properties. For most of human history, use of this strong, light metal was nearly impossible. That is, until people figured out how to mass produce aluminum. Steel is one of the most recycled metals in the world. The steel from over 14 million automobiles is recycled every year. Steel was the metal of the 19th century, but by the 20th century it found a rival. Aluminum has accelerated our technological progress in the relatively few years that we've been able to work it, which is fortunate since aluminum is not only the most abundant metal on Earth, it is the third most common element, making up more than 8% of the Earth's crust.
It is probably the most quintessential element in terms of being locked up. And its oxide, the bonds that it has with oxygen are so powerful that simple techniques that early man had were not sufficient to turn it into metallic form.
Early man had little use for aluminum, which was locked inside a clay-like amalgam called bauxite.
They didn't know what they had. They just had this special clay that had strength and different types of properties. Over the years, people began to understand that this aluminum oxide, alumina, was found in the Earth's crust and could be used and turned into a pure metal.
After pure aluminum was discovered in 1825, it was considered a precious metal with a value on par with gold. Aluminum is desirable because it is lightweight, malleable, and easily made into wire. Neither magnetic nor prone to sparking, it conducts electricity, which makes it useful for electrical transmission lines. It is a decorative metal, and it bonds easily with other metallic elements to create alloys much stronger and harder than pure aluminum. But for most of human history, aluminum could only be made in small quantities.
It was produced in laboratory kind of conditions in 1852 at $545 a pound. So at that time, it was more expensive than gold. It wasn't until 1886 that a process was developed to remove the oxides from aluminum and turn it into a viable material.
The key to commercial production of aluminum was harnessing electricity, not possible until the latter 19th century.
Charles Hall came up and developed the process which is now today used as the formal smelting process for actually making aluminum.
Hall introduced an electrical charge into the alloy aluminum oxide, or alumina, which forged a ball of metal as the electricity broke the bond between aluminum and oxygen. The ball was pure aluminum. This process is called an electrolytic reduction, and it requires a lot of energy, which is why aluminum plants are usually built near power sources. Hall founded the Alcoa Company with a group of investors in 1888. Today, Alcoa is the largest supplier of aluminum in the world. Despite its scale of production, it produces aluminum in much the same way Hall did over a century ago.
The main mineral deposits of bauxite would be found in the Caribbean, Australia, and in Africa. And those are the areas right now where we have our main mining operations. So it's much like any type of a mining operation. We go and we dig dirt. In fact, we have a little saying here that aluminum, it all starts with dirt.
Raw bauxite in the dirt is reduced and refined down to powdered alumina. At this point, the mining operation becomes a smelting one.
The smelting component of it is very complex. It requires massive amounts of electricity to unlock it from its ore state.
The method, essentially the same as Hall's original process, only on a larger scale, dissolves powdered alumina in a bath of the melted mineral cryolite, contained in carbon-lined pots. A very strong electric current separates oxygen out of the alumina as it passes through the cryolite bath. Molten aluminum is then cooled and fashioned into ingots or billets, sold to manufacturers and turned into rods for the construction industry, sheets for more than 100 billion aluminum cans a year, or even thinner sheets for aluminum foil. Window panes, siding, commuter trains, even baseball parks contain aluminum. Aluminum is inert in the human body and therefore relatively safe for storing food. It's even found in some toothpaste. But aluminum made its biggest impact on an industry that simply couldn't exist without it, the aeronautics industry.
One of the benefits of people traditionally, when they like to fly, like the plane to go up. And if you had a steel one, it would just weigh too much. About 90% of the metals across the board on a plane today are going to be aluminum or aluminum alloys. It's a huge benefit to have a lightweight, strong metal that can actually perform the way you want it to perform.
In fact, the very first airplane that ever flew at Kitty Hawk in 1903 included an Alcoa aluminum engine block, installed by Orville and Wilbur Wright. Nearly every airplane flying today is made of aluminum. Aluminum made possible the manned rockets to the moon and the space shuttle. Strong aluminum alloys are now being used extensively in automobiles.
If you've ever driven a big, heavy car, if you're going 40 miles an hour and you try to stop quickly, it takes a big, heavy car a little bit longer to stop than a lighter car. That's part of the performance factor. If you have a car that has a decent-sized engine within it, then you hit the accelerator and that car happens to be lighter, it takes less time for it to get to the speed that you want it. That's part of performance. So if you have an aluminum-intensive car, it's going to have different performance capabilities than a big, heavy type of car. So that's an example of why you might prefer to have aluminum versus steel.
Aluminum engines and panels may be strong and light and save on gas, but because of the energy costs associated with aluminum production, they're not as cheap as steel alloys, which are becoming ever lighter. Consumers must decide between performance and cost as the steel and aluminum industries vie for bigger shares of the market.
Aluminum does come at a bit of a premium to some other metals, depending upon what the metal might be, but to steel, for example, it is at a premium, and the way we go to manufacturers with that is we explain to them, while the pound-for-pound basis it might be more expensive, you have to look at it in totality.
The aluminum industry searches for more efficient, less expensive ways to process bauxite into marketable metal, even as it develops stronger, lighter alloys to compete with metals like steel. From copper and iron to steel and aluminum, our progress has been marked by newly applied metals that are stronger and lighter, though fundamentally similar to the metals that have come previously. But the metal of the future might just be a new alloy that behaves in ways we've never seen metals behave before. On December 6, 1884, the apex of the Washington Monument was capped with a 6.2-pound pyramid of rare pure cast aluminum, 8.8 inches tall and 5.4 inches wide at its base. As mankind advances, new opportunities for metal present themselves. Even though we may have known of a particular metal's existence for centuries, we had no use for it.
I think metal's importance determined what man was trying to accomplish at any given time.
Take the space-age metal titanium, first discovered in 1791 and produced commercially in 1946. It is as strong as steel, but 45% lighter. Easily fabricated and corrosion-resistant, titanium is alloyed with metals such as aluminum and iron for propeller shafts and rigging on ships, boats, and oil platforms. Because titanium is lightweight, it is used extensively for missile and rocket parts, and especially in the aeronautics industry. But people are probably most familiar with titanium as the principal material in lightweight, high-performance golf clubs. But the true future metals may not be the so-called new metals like titanium, as much as new structures, taking it all down to the molecular level, turning crystalline solids like titanium, iron, and aluminum alloys into glasses by melting them at extremely high temperatures, then rapidly cooling them. A company in California has already done it with a superalloy called liquid metal, made of steel, aluminum, and titanium.
Conventional metals crystallize when they solidify, they form crystals. Liquid metal is basically a frozen liquid. We call that a glass.
Like a solid, the molecules in a metallic glass do not move, but like a liquid, they are not aligned in a uniform pattern. This molecular condition makes them very strong. Further, they have fewer structural defects because they are often fused from a powder, providing uniform consistency. This process allows them to be efficiently molded, much like a plastic, rather than forged. Simultaneously, drop a ball bearing on a stainless steel plate, titanium plate, and a liquid metal plate, and you see just how much stronger, harder, and elastic the metallic glass is.
Its strength, for example, then, is typically 2 to 3 times stronger than the same material in the crystalline state.
Maybe the future will see super light, super strong automobiles and airplanes made out of metallic glasses. At the National Institute of Standards and Technology, scientists spend their careers testing and retesting metals and alloys to better understand and exploit their unique properties. Their work might lead to the development of more powerful computer drives, the size of a grain of rice, microscopic wires only 40 atoms wide, or magnet-powered refrigerators that run not on electricity, but spinning magnetic disks. There are even metals that can remember their original crystalline shape after you dent them. Dr. Richard Fields is working on these shape memory metals.
This is a super elastic material, and here you can see I try to bend it, and of course it doesn't seem to, it doesn't stay bent very well, okay? Now, let me show you what happens when I make this material cold. Okay, now I've had that same wire sitting in here in some dry ice, so it's good and cold, and now when I bend it, you see, it bends just fine. And if you watch it as it warms up, it does something perhaps you're not used to in a metal, okay? It unbends slowly. And that's the shape memory effect. Okay, now this material here is also like the superelastic material, but it's a slightly different composition. This is the real memory metal, so-called nitinol, nickel titanium. This material, you'll see, I can bend quite easily in contrast to the other material. However, if I put this in hot water, it immediately unbends and returns to its original shape. Wouldn't you like to have a car made out of that? Throw a bucket of hot water on the dent and it's all gone.
NIST scientists are also studying wreckage from the World Trade Center in an effort to create better steel. Structural steel will lose about 90% of its strength in a fire that raises its temperature to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 15 minutes. A 90% loss of strength will topple a skyscraper, but adding just 1% of the metal chromium and 0.5% of the metal molybdenum will cause the steel to retain as much as 50% of its strength at 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. With only 50% loss of strength, steel will not fail as quickly because of the higher melting temperature. A burning skyscraper will stay up longer.
I think we've been able to develop steels that have gone maybe 100 degrees above where the current ones, 100 degrees centigrade. If the World Trade Center had been built out of these steels, certainly have given you a little more time. My current feeling is that these steels can be used effectively in many applications that might be exposed to fires.
Japanese and German engineers are already putting this alloy to use in new structures. As scientists continue to create new metals with unusual and original properties, other scientists are busy developing applications for those metals. Around we go, from discovery to invention, as we have for thousands of years. Ever since that first person pulled a lump of molten copper out of a fire and forged it into shape, transforming a collection of people into a striving civilization.